"These trees would make fine chests for the dead, sir." So said the guide of George Borrow during his expedition into Wales in the 1860s. Upon hearing this, his mood changed to one of sadness, and he writes, "I remember that, in a few short years at most, we should all be laid in the cold, narrow houses, formed of 4 elm or oaken boards, our only garments the flannel shroud, the cold, damp earth above us, instead of the bright, glorious sun. Oh, how sad and mournful I became! I soon comforted myself, however, by reflecting that such is the will of heaven, and that heaven is good." This mournful prose perhaps captures something of the fascination and the effect that these old, crumbling cemeteries can have upon us. So, in this documentary I set out to trace the history of the Victorian cemetery, from its obscure beginnings to its uncertain future. To help me on this journey, I set out for Cunnery Road, a moving example of the strange beauty of the burial place. Until the turn of the 19th century, many dead of a parish were buried in the churchyard closest to their home or village. Here, in Anglican consecrated ground, passages from the Book of Common Prayer would be read at every funeral, and members from non-Anglican denominations were forbidden to be buried there. Because of this, some of the earliest forerunners to cemeteries like Conary Road began with religion rather than health in mind. From the 1650s, we can find evidence of non-Anglican burial places coming into existence around the country, such as the Alderney Road burial place in Whitechapel, London of 1697, or the Quaker burial ground in Jordan's Buckinghamshire, a simple grass plot laid out in a grid with basic, almost identical looking gravestones. This wish to be buried in a sacred or consecrated ground is perhaps as old as humanity. We have long wished to return our beloved dead to the earth, and so before travelling to Cunnery Road, I called in at this museum to see for myself one of the earliest burials in the region, the Amesbury Beaker burial, that of a young child of the Bronze Age, unearthed from a farmer's field. Why were they chosen for burial over others in the settlement? Were they the son or daughter of a leader, or simply a child of whom was loved? Even further back in time, we can see evidence of our ancestors being buried in large, elaborate stone tombs, sometimes their site aligning with the passage of the sun or stars, and suggesting a mystical connection, and perhaps a hope of reunion.
The builders of Newgrange actually built it so it was perfect for sunrise in 3200 BC. Nowadays, of course, we can do it with modern equipment very, very easily. But for somebody from 3200 BC to try and actually determine the point of what we call the winter solstice would have been difficult enough. But it does indicate that they were extremely intelligent and very civilized.
For those in the Victorian age, however, the creation of the cemetery was not merely a matter of religion or belief. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, urban populations were growing massively, and the old parish churchyards were filling up, their conditions growing increasingly unsanitary. Soon, as in Europe, a cemetery movement began to appear, often echoing the ancient Roman ideals of burying the dead outside of or at the very edges of the town. In the 1820s, the idea of constructing such cemeteries in England became popular, helped in part by the likes of George Frederick Carden, of whom campaigned for them in his publication, The Penny Magazine. According to Carden, Britain's burial grounds were hideous, a far cry from those of Europe, of which he described as frequently beautiful. Indeed, one of the greatest inspirations for cemeteries such as Cunnery Road was the large abode of the dead, founded in Paris in 1809, and known as the cemetery Père Lachaise. Here, the idea was Elysium Fields, the cemetery built as a garden, complete with avenues of trees and pleasant natural landscapes, making it a space that one would want to visit, and at the same time creating a peaceful and reflective atmosphere to remember. This began to be echoed in the creation of cemeteries in Britain, of which were often formed in green areas on the edges of towns, and included memorials echoing this Arcadian image, such as these designs seen on the grave of a wealthy family here at Conary Road. Large trees, often the sacred and evergreen oak, were planted during the creation of the grid pattern of the cemetery. Visiting today, it is quite moving to see these giants, like this one, of whom have silently witnessed the coming and going of hundreds of funerals, mourners, and fashions. What would lie on these sites before the creation of Victorian garden cemeteries? In the city of Liverpool, the first city to be chosen as the site of a garden cemetery in 1829, the site chosen was that of a 12-acre quarry, of which was soon landscaped into the form of a garden cemetery inspired by Père Lachaise, and was to become very popular, indeed being once described as the most romantic place in England. In fact, areas of land with very little actual use were chosen for the creation of cemeteries. After all, this type of land could be purchased cheap, and although publicly funded cemeteries were rare until the 1850s, the Burials Act would eventually lead to such areas being purchased from the public purse, in order to create both an attractive and safe location for the dead, of which by now would include all religious denominations, rather than the segregated grounds from previous decades.
But when in those days, if I had wanted a grave, would I have just pointed to a piece of land and said, that's the bit I want? How would I remember it, or how would my relatives remember it, or how would you remember it?
Which would I be on the job, I would, sir, if it's running for years, sir.
Would you mark it in any way?
I know, I'd skip it, sir, and let the next graves come in here, sir. Yeah. And if you told me I want 2 graves.
Well, what's your feeling now, Podge, about death, having buried, 1,300 people?
Well, I'll tell you the truth, sir. When the day comes, no matter what you have, when your eyes is your best, no matter what you have or what you haven't, off you go.
Conary Road was opened in 1869, and appears to have been built upon the site near to gravel pits and woodland coppices. The popularity of the cemetery is evident immediately. The graves appear almost uncomfortably close together, although this does achieve the effect of making the by now standard grid layout of the cemetery very clear. Just as with its larger cousins in the cities, this cemetery was designed as a wooded enclosure, and those of all religious affinities were permitted to be buried here. Most, of course, are decidedly Christian when examined, with popular motifs of flowers and mourning showing the fashions of the day, and epitaphs often evoking a particular favourite psalm, the 23rd, wherein the Lord makes me lie down in green pastures, and promises us all that we shall one day dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Other epitaphs, which echo the funeral fashions of the time, are the Memento Mori, a less religious message of which attempts to make the passer-by acutely aware of their own mortality. Danger stands thick throughout the ground, this one reads, to push us to the tomb, and fierce disease waits around to hurry mortals home. This messaging was likely to be found not only on the gravestone, but also on the coffin itself, and even in the choices of jewellery, with mourning brooches made popular after the loss of Prince Albert, and sometimes containing a lock of the deceased's hair. I was able to examine this brass funeral plaque, dating from the Victorian times and showing the phrase, "at rest," having once been placed onto the top of a coffin. That one may feel there is subtly different atmospheres at play inside a cemetery was partly inspired by design, as the entryways into these spaces were designed as a gateway into Elysium, the eternal garden and dwelling place of the gods. Cunnery Road has a simple gateway, and yet its larger cousins saw sometimes extravagant gates housing the cemetery office and lodging of the keeper. Architect William Hoskin was known for such designs, creating hugely symbolic cemetery gates, such as those at Abney Park in Stoke Newington. Above his lodges, he engraved "the gates of the abode of the mortal part of men." Of course, these cemetery gates served another purpose as well as a symbolic crossing into the realm of the dead. They could be locked at night also, thus preventing theft and vandalism.
When you see all the one flood down, they all been pushed down by vandals. We know in the summer you just got grass cutting and other little jobs, but in the winter is all what you do, isn't it? Sometimes you see something behind you, but you're thinking there is someone behind you, but there's no one, so there's no better place really to work, really.
Perhaps one of the most important names of cemetery creation, however, was that of John Claudius Loudon, of whose detailed account of them, on the laying out, planting and managing of cemeteries, was published in 1843. He was responsible for the grid layout of many such places, and also of the building of boundary walls, traditionally of 10 feet high, surrounding a cemetery, with railings in place so that those on the outside could see the peace within. Noting that funerals may take place at any point within the grounds, he also planned for a large central path leading off onto the various smaller paths around the grids. One can see this clearly at Conary Road, although the smaller paths have since disappeared. Loudon also designed for cemeteries to be a place with an abundance of trees and planting, although he insisted it must not look like the gardens of the rich, and so disliked the planting of flowers, preferring instead conical shrubs and dark green leafy trees. Perhaps the most important aspect of Loudon's cemetery designs, and no doubt a driving force in the upcoming expansion of cemetery building in the 1860s, was the insistence that a cemetery should not merely be for remembrance, but as a place of instruction. That is to say, an area where one would walk to in order to be reminded of morals and taste, as well as botany, architecture, and even as a kind of family resort, a place to enjoy and reflect, as well as to remember. This, of course, is helped by the abundance of interesting epitaphs and monuments of which found their way into cemeteries, making them places that tell the story of a place and inspire the exploration of the grounds, as the passerby can read the stones and learn from them. Flowers being left on graves during such visits became a popular activity, and many stones were made with this in mind, such as seen here with this odd 3D shaped grave, of which has long forgotten holes for flowers beneath it. And here we may see that even today these rather sad looking flowers were left in the not too distant past upon this grave of one of whom is still remembered. This leaving of offerings and gifts has continued ever since, and here we see the grave of a small child with sad and faded memorials at their stone, and here a long forgotten statue, of which seems to have become entwined with the overgrowth. At Cunnery Road there are in fact a great many memorials that tell the stories of which would inspire those of whom choose to visit the cemetery. This one shows a real anchor actually set into the stone of the grave. It is to remember one of the many of whom perished at sea during the Titanic disaster, the body of Leopold Turner having never been found when the ship went down. And here is the grave of Charles Sylvester Horne, the father of the well-known Kenneth Horne, well remembered for his radio series Around the Horn. One may even find this sad little memorial in remembrance of one killed by blackwater fever, a rare complication of malaria. We may also be reminded of the fact that since Conary Road closed in 1942, it saw burials from the First World War and one from the Second. Here is the grave of a soldier of whom was blinded in action in 1915, with the inscription, "God took away mine eyes, so that my soul may see." And here is one of the final burials in the cemetery, that of an airman killed in action in the Second World War. Conary Road was part of a great boom in cemetery building, seeing as the general population had roughly doubled from 1859 to 1909. Loudon's ideas were central to many cemeteries, and there were even architectural competitions enacted for cemetery creation, the winner being able to transform the scrub land into their own design for the latest cemetery. William Gay was one such designer, and in fact he came to specialise in cemetery design. Amongst his creations was Toxteth Park in Liverpool, of which was the first publicly funded cemetery to be built during this boom period. And since many cemeteries were built on the fringes of towns and cities, with unused and underdeveloped land surrounding them, it was easy to return to them later and expand them when the need arose, and efforts were often made to ensure that the new sections reflected the original design of the older parts. By the time of the First World War, many small cemeteries had significantly expanded, losing their original grid pattern and returning to the serpentine pathways of old. This effect has largely passed by the cemetery of Conary Road, of which continued to be filled with its graves as close together as possible until its eventual closure. One wonders, however, how many more years this cemetery could have had, for it appears full, and thus most likely resembles some of the earlier cemeteries designed by Loudon before they were returned to and extended. One could argue that the arrival of cremation heralded the end of the traditional cemetery. The Cremation Society of England was formed in 1874, to some opposition from orthodox groups of whom objected to the burning of bodies. Still, the first crematorium was constructed in Woking in 1889, and in 1902 a large and spectacular cremation chapel was built in Golders Green, London, designed by Sir Ernest George, with renowned landscape gardener William Robinson consulted for the 12-acre plot. This, as well as other crematoriums which sprang up around this time, may have heralded what was to come in the shape of the decline of the Victorian garden cemetery. The interest in death and mourning seen with the Victorians declined sharply in the 20th century, and with it the Victorian cemetery began to fall into disrepair. Many were abandoned completely, their gravestones later removed and laid flat in order to reduce the possibility of accidents, and yet condemning those interred there to be forgotten and lost forevermore. Loudon believed that when a cemetery was full, it should be closed and treated instead as a kind of public garden. In many ways, his wish has come true, with many old cemeteries, including Cunnery Road, having been taken over by local authorities as places of historic and natural importance. Here at Conary Road, the cemetery is now cared for as a haven for wildlife, and is thus left at the mercy of time and nature. One cannot help but feel something is sad about the state of some of these memorials, crumbling away, falling down and often illegible as time and weather has erased the names of the deceased. In recent times, however, there has been a renewed interest in the preservation of such places, with websites such as Find a Grave asking volunteers to walk the olden paths of cemeteries and photograph, document and list those buried there. There is even a name for those of whom enjoy the experience of walking through such places: taphophilia, one fond of epitaphs, also known as a tombstone tourist. In many ways, this continued interest in these cemeteries have proved that the designs of such places transcends time, speaking to us on a deeper level than merely a desire to mark out the places of the dead. They invite us to sit, or to wander slowly through fields of memory, musing upon the nature of our own lives and of our mortality. Perhaps, just like those very earliest of burials, of where the ancestors were placed into the earth in chambered tombs, maybe to re-enter a kind of womb of Mother Earth, we too feel connected to our earthly home in such places, the voices of nature playing out as we wander amongst those of whom, at one point, also walked there, and thought about the very same things that we do now. From the silent voices on their epitaphs, they ask us to cherish our short days in the sun, and to leave the cemetery in the knowledge that one day we will follow them